I'm very glad to be here, and Clara is reasonably glad to be here too. And I must say, experiences from Belgium, I must tell you that my first surgical experience, I'm a medical person, was during an internship in Saalgrenska Sjukhuset in Göteborg. And I was halfway medical school then, and very honored to be allowed to the emergency department during the weekend. And during the weekend, as you may know, ships go out from Göteborg harbor with people on board for cheap liquor. And so on Saturday evening, or was it Sunday evening, they come back with lots of injured people who fall down gangways on the ship. And so my very first patient, I was allowed. Okay. My very first patient I was allowed to sew up had a bad cut on his head. He'd fallen down after too much drink, and happened to be an American student. And as he was lying there, and I was sweating and doing my very first stitches, he said, "Oh, young person, oh, those are my first stitches." And and then the nurse, one of those emancipated Swedish big-mouthed girls, said, "Hans också." So this is going to be about the experience in Belgium of liberal legislation for euthanasia. So this work, of course, is teamwork, and this is the end-of-life research group, care research group, and also indebted to the current president of the Federation Palliative Care Flanders, and to the past president, who is also now the president of the Life and Information Forum, euthanasia doctors, you could say. There are of physician-assisted dying, there are 3 direct cases. One is euthanasia, which is by definition upon explicit request by the patient. The other is doctor-assisted suicide, and the third is life abbreviation without explicit request from the patient. Those are the 3 radical life end actions. And here is, to summarize things, the situation in Australia and New Zealand. I do not have figures for Sweden, but I'm told they exist. And here for Belgium in 1996 and 2003 for Australia and Belgium. In 1998, before the legislation, and which was in 2002, and in 2007. What you see is that the overall incidence of all deaths, among all deaths, of a medical intervention which was likely or possibly or certainly abbreviating life survival, that was very high in all countries. What you see, this is the overall epidemiological picture, the evolution of things over the years, before and after the legislation. And the main you see that the total incidence of life abbreviation by the physician is a bit similar in the different countries, and it's not significantly changed since the law. It has not increased, but the 2 major categories have changed. Euthanasia proper, which is upon request, was high also in Australia, which still has no legislation, and euthanasia has increased, almost doubled in Belgium. At the same time, life abbreviation without specific request has halved. So the major impact epidemiologically of the legislation has been to change, to move cases from terminal life abbreviation by the physician at his initiative, but without a request from the patient, to the same thing, but upon the request of the patient. And I must add, earlier, not in the extreme agony of what it was before the legislation. This has been the most important change. This was to summarize the situation, and now we'll get into the meat of the next slide, please. Yes. What you see, these are the questions I propose to address. First, I want to tell you more about what I call the Belgian model of integral end-of-life care. Then we'll ask the history of how it came about, say 2. Third, we'll ask the question whether there was anything like a so-called slippery slope, namely whether the legislation brought about undesirable and undesired and unexpected evolutions. How did end-of-life practice evolve under the law? The fourth question will be, how do palliative care and legal euthanasia interrelate? Are they antagonistic, as most people believe in most parts of the world, or are they, as Belgians now know, synergistic? And then a few take-home messages. Now this is Benelux. It's very small, but there's quite a crowd there. Almost 28 million people or so, 26. And the Netherlands were the first. The Netherlands were the first to regulate euthanasia, namely already in the as of 1990, where there were agreements, discussions and agreements between the judiciary, the legal system, and the medical profession, and where it was agreed that euthanasia, that is, life ending upon request, would not be prosecuted if it were carried out according to a number of carefulness guidelines. And these same carefulness guidelines eventually came to be written into the law in 2002. And it is also in 2002 that Belgium enacted a similar, very similar euthanasia law, and finally Luxembourg. The question is Belgium a laboratory for things to come elsewhere in the world? Possibly. A definition of euthanasia is that it is intentionally terminating the life of a person by another person at that first person's request. So euthanasia is by definition voluntary euthanasia. And it is legal under Belgian law if, 1, there is a repeated, consistent request under no external pressure or coercion in writing, and when a person wishes to express her wishes for her end of life, in the case she would be incompetent, for instance comatose, then these wishes can be expressed in writing, and they are advance directives. These wishes must come from a competent adult person who must be suffering in 2 ways: intolerably and irreversibly, so that there is no chance that this suffering would improve and become tolerable. So you notice intolerable is really the competence of the patient. It is the patient who must find something intolerable, and it is the physician who must decide that it is irreversible. So this is really joint decision-making by patient and physician. It must be caused by an irreversible medical condition, sickness. And the patient must, according to the law, be duly informed of alternatives to euthanasia, namely including palliative care. And it must be carried out by a medical doctor, no one else than a medical doctor, who, that doctor, must consult the nursing staff, the nurses, and a competent colleague. Another medical doctor must be consulted, who must ascertain, also concur, that the condition is irreversible, and that the other conditions for the law are met. If the patient is not expected to die within the foreseeable future, then another medical doctor must be consulted, and a moratorium, they must wait for a month before carrying out the euthanasia. This is what occurs usually by when the case is a case of motor neuron disease, severe degenerative neurological diseases such as multiple sclerosis or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Then the patient is not going to die within the foreseeable future. He might live on in fact for years in a wretched situation, but then when that patient requests euthanasia, that can be done only after 1 month of reflection. And then all cases must be reported to a national control and evaluation commission. The principles which underlie this legislation are procedural ethics, meaning they are not prescriptive ethics or normative ethics. The ethics of the ethics of the legislation are that are to ensure that no ethical principles are violated in the procedure. That is done by fixing a definite procedure on how to proceed with such a decision. So there's two organizations in Belgium which deal with this. One is organizations for the end of life. One is the palliative care, Federation of Palliative Care Services, and the other is the Life and Information Physicians, LEIF, who are a group of physicians but also nurses and professionals who are in the service, at the service of colleagues to come and help with euthanasia, because of course euthanasia is still a very rare event and very few doctors have experience, and too many doctors do not know the law too well. The Federation of Palliative Care for Flanders, that's the northern and Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, took euthanasia on board, accepted euthanasia, and it is so far the only palliative care organization in the world which has explicitly adopted euthanasia procedures. What it says is that palliative care and euthanasia are neither alternatives nor antagonistic. Euthanasia may be part of palliative care. However, caregivers in the palliative care service are entitled to ethical limitations. They can say, not me, don't ask me. But if they do not want to participate in euthanasia, they must say this ahead of time, in due time to their patients, so that the patients can then ask to be taken care of by someone else than someone who refuses to carry out euthanasia. This is the official position of the palliative care organization in Flanders. Is this so far unique in the world that a palliative care organization takes on board euthanasia? Is this an oddity of Belgium? Well, there are oddities in Belgium. You know, this is the detour in Dutch and a detour in French. So there are odd things in Belgium. But this is the idyllic situation in the with palliative care patients. This is the daycare center for palliative care of my Free University of Brussels University Hospital. And in these same buildings are the headquarters, both of the Federation of Palliative Care and of the Life and Information Forum, Euthanasia Doctors. So, what is now this Belgian model of end-of-life care? What are its concepts? Well, integral end-of-life care, if you see it like this, consists of conventional palliative care and euthanasia, but they overlap. And if you look at all deaths, about 30% of all deaths in the country go through palliative care. And of those, 1% of all deaths, so a small minority, ends up having euthanasia by the ministrations of palliative care. And another 1% dies with euthanasia without having been in contact or having involved palliative care. So this is the overall situation. And I suggest, even better, I suggest to call this palliative care, which has taken on board euthanasia, I suggest to call integral palliative care. So if you now consider not the concepts, but the personnel and the organization, the physicians involved in palliative care are palliative care physicians, and then there are next to that the Life and Information Forum physicians, and of course other physicians, general practitioners, oncologists, neurologists, etc., who might be members of both Life and Information or palliative, among the palliative care physicians. So there's a major overlap between the different concepts and also the different groups of physicians. But is this an oddity of Belgium? Well, we must remember that Dame Cicely Saunders, who founded the palliative care movement in the United Kingdom in the 1950s, 60s, that she was quite explicit that the whole idea of palliative care was to prevent euthanasia. The idea was, if you have good palliative care, there will be no need for euthanasia. So that the situation in Belgium is totally different. In fact, we'll end up with the conclusion that we have created palliative care in Belgium for one of the reasons was in order to make euthanasia possible. And let's look at the foundations of palliative care and legal euthanasia. Clinically, palliative care is of course about the relief of suffering and the prevention of medical futility, futile medical treatment which is senseless given the situation. For euthanasia, it is also, of course, relief of suffering, but here it's a prevention of palliative futility, keeping someone alive who no longer wishes to be kept alive. Palliative futility, which is a novel notion. The ethical priorities are beneficence, first in palliative care, and respect for patient autonomy. Those are the major ethical values served. And for euthanasia, they're the same, but probably in a different order. There is a priority to patient autonomy, and beneficence is understood to be the respect of the patient's autonomy. That is being beneficent in euthanasia. The life stance of the advocates is often religious for palliative care and is most often agnostic or atheistic among the advocates of euthanasia. The potential for abuse is palliative futility, is going on with palliative treatment when a patient no longer wants it. And the potential for abuse in euthanasia, and we'll deal with that, is the slippery slope, and to be euthanasia to be a substitute for palliative care. The danger being that, oh, we need no good care for the terminally ill because we have euthanasia. The public support is universal for palliative care, and there's vast majorities in most advanced countries, and they are still increasing. This is just a graphic representation in many countries for the evolution of the public support for legal euthanasia. As you can see, in all advanced countries, the support among the public is increasing. Now, that is not the support for euthanasia is absent among the European Association for Palliative Care organization and its members. There, the official positions were blanket rejection on a basis of essentialistic motives. They considered in 1995 that there was a fundamental, irreconcilable antagonism between the ideas of palliative care and legal euthanasia. However, in 2003, the position was a little bit more restrained, and they said, and the author of this paper, position paper, was Dr. Matterstvedt from Norway. They said that euthanasia should not be part of the responsibility of palliative care. You know, we do not touch euthanasia with a pole. It's outside of our interests, and the reasons were more pragmatic. The reasons were, we will not do euthanasia if someone else wants to do it, but not us, because we worry about slippery slope effects. If there's legislation, we'll end up in places where we don't want to be. And second, euthanasia law would hinder the development of palliative care. It would be used to avoid investments in palliative care. So these two issues, those two major arguments against legal euthanasia are what was investigated extensively in the Netherlands and Belgium, and I will show you the results of. So the slippery slope effect that is most understandably dreaded by opponents of legal euthanasia is, of course, life ending without explicit request. In fact, as you saw before, which is a situation which does occur in all countries which have no law on euthanasia. But so this fear of life abbreviation of patients who have not requested this is nicely shown in the following cartoon. This is euthanasia without consent, right? And this man says, over my dead body, right? Next question. How did this law on euthanasia come about in Belgium? Well, it was quite different in Belgium from the Netherlands. Don't try to read this in any detail, but what you see here is the history between 1980 and nowadays. And in green are the milestones on the way to legal euthanasia. And in orange, the milestones in the development of the palliative care system in Belgium. So it's the palliative care system started in Belgium in 1979 or 80 at our initiative at the Free University of Brussels, which is, some of you might know, a university which is really something like the antidote to the Catholic University of Leuven. It is a university specifically dedicated to, quote-unquote, free thought and free inquiry. So it's a secular, explicitly secular university. But we took the initiative of going and seeing what palliative care was in the United Kingdom, and we were quite impressed, and we created a first organization in Brussels which was called the CCC, Continuing Care Community. And it must be said that this was the first initiative outside of the United Kingdom in continental Europe. And our objectives right from the start were we want palliative care because of its intrinsic value, but also because we consider palliative care to open the possibility to have legal euthanasia. Because if you do not have correct palliative care, you will never be able to legalize euthanasia, because for good reasons people will object to that, to euthanasia without the possibility of palliative care. So this organization, Continuing Care Community, was created with this double objective. We regretted having called it Continuing Care Community, CCC, because we made, in the media, we made only a very modest impact in the media, but people who did make a major impact in the media, who called themselves also CCC, were the Cellules Communistes Combattantes. And they blew up, they put bombs at the headquarters of NATO, and they were a rather disreputable bunch. So we abbreviated the name to Continuing Care, and we lived on in peace. Another major milestone was here, a report by the so-called Governmental Advisory Council on bioethical matters. This was a committee very pluralistically constituted with respected philosophers or ethicists or representatives of the different religions, and also representatives of the secularist humanistic organizations, who came up with a report telling Parliament, telling the Belgian people and the government that they had four alternatives with end-of-law issues. Either they could keep euthanasia in the law as murder, not change, or they could totally, oh thank you, yes, or they could totally liberalize it. Very good. They could liberalize it completely. And in between, two other alternatives were to regulate it. And you could regulate it before the fact, namely, you could, candidates for euthanasia would have to pass an exam, and euthanasia, there would be a priori regulation of euthanasia. Or
it could be a posteriori regulation. In other words, euthanasia could be carried out, but the physician who carried it out must justify himself, must be accountable, and report the case, and the case would then be judged, be reviewed by a competent body. And in case there was something not clear in the report, then only an investigation would be carried out. And then the doctor would be called to that body and would have to justify his actions if they were not completely according to the law. So those were the four options that were given to the polity, to the community, and Belgian Parliament, which then had for the first time a left of centre majority government, adopted the a posteriori regulation option, which gave us the law that we have, and which is very, very similar to the law in the Netherlands and Luxembourg. You also see that the budget for palliative care in 2002 was doubled, because what really happened is that there were three bills at the time in 2002, within a few weeks, passed by Parliament: patient rights bill, euthanasia bill, and a bill expanding palliative care to cover the whole country, and every hospital had to have a palliative care unit, and every Belgian person must have access to palliative care services in the home, and therefore the budget was doubled. So this was a package, right? This all came together. It must be said that a peculiarity of Belgium is the confidence of the people in the healthcare system. Before the law it was quite high, it was the highest in Europe, and after the law, and this is rather important, because one of the major objections of the medical profession against legalizing euthanasia, their objection is that, and it is an understandable but unjustified objection, is that euthanasia might undermine the confidence that people have in the medical profession. The people might worry that when a doctor comes in, he might be their killer. So, if anything, the confidence in the medical profession has increased still after the legislation, and it is the highest in Europe. This is according to data from the European Values Study. Still in the history, regulatorily, in other words, the regulating bodies, I emphasize again that the three laws were passed together by the Belgian Parliament. The Belgium linked palliative care and euthanasia and patient rights. The Belgian Medical Disciplinary Board issued guidelines, joint guidelines for euthanasia and palliative care, which are considered really a little bit inseparable. And then you've seen that slide before. That was the taking on board of physician-assisted death, which is essentially euthanasia, by palliative care in Belgium. And interestingly, although the part of the medical profession was opposed to legal euthanasia, and certainly the major part of the clergy and of the church, which in Belgium is mainly the Catholic Church, so many of them turned around after the legislation. And this is interesting because it suggests that this man, for instance, is a colleague, a doctor, and he's head of palliative care service. He's also a Jesuit priest. And he says here that when he comes around to recognizing that euthanasia can be a good thing. He wrote a book against euthanasia before. And the interesting thing is that we all agree that laws are the accomplishment of evolutions, of shifts in the culture among the public in democracies. And so they are for sure. But also laws can change the culture. After a law is enacted, that ends up changing the culture. Another example of this is that the majority in the UK of the people in the UK wanted to keep the death sentence. The death sentence was abolished by politicians who took the lead, and then the majority of the people turned against the death sentence. It's an interesting interaction between the people and the law. We get to the next section, is was there evidence of slippery slope? How was the evolution of practices under the law? And this is the most difficult part for you because there's lots of statistics, but we don't have to go in all the details. But I owe you the data, and those of you who are interested can look them up. And those are epidemiological studies which were published in very prominent medical journals. And let's remind you the terminology. Medical end-of-life decisions are all decisions which may have or certainly have a life-shortening effect. And there's three major categories. There's physician-assisted dying, and we saw that, which is euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, and life ending without request. Then there is another category, much milder, is intensified alleviation of pain and symptoms by increasing doses of drugs, but which might have possibly have a life-shortening effect, which is, for instance, a position which is not, admitted, in fact encouraged by, for instance, the Catholic Church. And then there are non-treatment decisions, that is withholding or withdrawing, possibly life-prolonging medical treatments. Those are the three major groups. This is what was investigated. How did these practices change between before and after the euthanasia law? And then there's a last category, which is continued deep sedation, which is administering sedative drugs to keep the patient in a deep coma until his death. And that can be done either while still giving fluid, and in that case the abbreviation of life is uncertain. What happens is that the patient eventually dies, that's the idea of the underlying disease, but he's no longer conscious and he no longer suffers. But it can also be done without giving artificial fluid and food, and then I propose to call it slow euthanasia. That is a category apart because apart from this being done, the case might also have been one of discontinuing treatment or of increased pain and symptom alleviation. So this is a category apart, but which is has become very important because certainly in the Benelux countries, but I'm sure also in your country, this is the option which is preferred by physician instead of euthanasia, and they apply it more and more. I'm not sure it is the solution which is preferred by the patients. We do not know this too well. It certainly is preferred by physicians, and it is very much practiced in palliative care settings. This, I think this is another rendition of a slide that I showed you in the beginning. These are the percentage end-of-life decision before and after the law, and here the statistical difference, significance, euthanasia doubled, physician-assisted suicide remained very, very rare. That really is not a preference of patients, obviously. You may know that this only is legal in a few states in the United States, Oregon, Washington states, Montana, but obviously in the Netherlands and Belgium, this is not what patients want. And then there's life ending without request, which was reduced after the law, and the total number of life-ending decisions did not change really. So that, terrifyingly, before the law, because there was a threat that a physician applying euthanasia could be brought to court and charged with murder, a patient who was suffering, in the worst case, before the law, a patient was more likely to die suffering intolerably if she asked for euthanasia than if she didn't. Because if she asked for euthanasia, that would be known to the nursing staff or the family, and there was a risk that a physician might be indicted. But if she didn't ask, if the patient did not ask, then the physician felt assured enough to abbreviate life. So this is, interestingly, the change has been a change in major, not so much in practices as in the ethical context in which these end-of-life practices are done. So a change towards patient autonomy is the major impact. There's another important thing, is that the carefulness of the decisions, end-of-life decisions in general, are more discussed with family, with patient of course, but also with family, with colleagues, with nursing staff. And this is, the family for instance, is much more involved in the end of life now than before the law. So the law has improved, also the law on patient right has improved the procedural ethics of the end of life. And very importantly also, here, the alleviation of pain and symptoms has increased very significantly since the law. So what this is, for instance, typically the work of palliative care services. Palliative care, the tenets of palliative care have been boosted, have been encouraged very much by the legislation. And the legislation has mainly changed the ethical, the autonomy is much more respected since the law. So no slippery slope. On the contrary, maybe there was a slippery slope before the law, but if anything, the law has changed, has moved up the situation, up the slippery slope of in ethical terms. So the conclusions are that the law was followed by an increase in all types of medical end-of-life decisions, except life ending without request, which was substantially reduced. The tenets of palliative care were increasingly applied. For instance, there was a substantial increase in terminal sedation, and we can further illustrate this by the following slides. You want to know who received euthanasia, how many cases were there, and where was that? How many cases? Well, almost 2% of all deaths in Belgium. There are in Belgium 10 million easy. Belgium is an easy country in many respects. It has 10 million inhabitants, and there are 100,000 deaths, and 2% are with euthanasia. So that's about 2,000 per year patients receive euthanasia. This is much more easier than for the Netherlands with very complicated figures, but the same percentages. So let's see an analysis of euthanasia cases that were reported to the Federal Control and Evaluation Commission. The total number of cases which were reported since the law in 2002 keeps increasing. And interestingly, we'll discuss this over drinks later this afternoon maybe, but the number are quite different between the Dutch, Flemish-speaking northern part of the country, which is about half of the population, and the French-speaking part. They carry out euthanasia almost probably a little bit less than in Flanders, but they don't report it. As for the diagnosis of the patients, when the patients were terminally ill for euthanasia, they were almost always cancer cases. When they're not terminally ill, they were usually neuromuscular disease, such as multiple sclerosis. The suffering was, when they are terminally ill, was essentially physical, but also, very importantly, mental. And among the non-terminally ill, quite a few of them did not suffer physically. 1/3 did not suffer physically, obviously, but the majority, vast majority, suffered mentally. So you could see the indication for euthanasia is not, of course, not only physical suffering, it is suffering. There's more euthanasia in cancer. This 83% of euthanasia carried or reported euthanasias are cancer, whereas it's only 1/4 of all deaths are caused by cancer. So cancer is definitely overrepresented among euthanasia recipients. As for the age of the patient, this is important because you remember, or you are aware, that one of the major objections against legal euthanasia is the fear of slippery slope effects. In other words, is that vulnerable patients, vulnerable people, the uneducated or the very elderly, would be quote-unquote eliminated in a country with a liberal euthanasia law. Well, let's look at the age, and you can see that among the elderly over 80 years are underrepresented among people who receive euthanasia. Euthanasia tends to be more in younger patients. So this is the general population. So 50% of deaths occur after 80 years, and only 18% of elderly receive euthanasia. So this invalidates this concern that euthanasia would be statistically used to eliminate elderly. The place of death is in blue the hospital, in yellow the home. And only less than 1/4 of people die in their own house, in their own home, among the general public. But it's double that for euthanasia. So euthanasia is a practice which is carried out more often, much more often in the patient's home than when the death is not by euthanasia. And half of euthanasia cases are practiced by general practitioners in the home of the patient. Very little euthanasia in care homes, right, or in elderly people care homes, and that is mainly because although about 1/4 of the people die in an elderly care home, that is because many of these patients in care homes are no longer competent and therefore cannot or no longer either do not ask for euthanasia, or if they ask for it, it cannot be honored because they are no longer competent because of mental degradation like Alzheimer's disease. So euthanasia is more at home and seldom in nursing homes. In conclusion, euthanasia is increasingly reported. You should note that the life abbreviation goes estimated life abbreviation, how much shorter has your patient lived because of euthanasia. Well, between 1 day to several years, but in the vast majority of cases it is less than a week. And it's more at home by general practitioners in cancer, in younger patients, in the higher educated. Vulnerable patients, it's very important, are underrepresented among the recipients of euthanasia. So there is no evidence for abuse, there is no evidence for slippery slope. Relationship between physician-assisted death and palliative care, how did they interact? Antagonism or synergy? Well, this is looking, but we'll skip that. This is looking at whether the patient, the physician, differences between physicians trained in palliative care and not trained. And it turns out that physicians trained in palliative care do not practice euthanasia any less than the others. In fact, if anything, they practice it more. And you can see this better here. This is the distribution of deaths when no palliative care was used. And this is where palliative care was used. And you can see that there's explicit life-ending practices are much more frequent in palliative care than when there is no palliative care. For euthanasia, for instance, which is here in green, euthanasia is twice more frequent in a palliative care setting than when palliative care is not involved. So this is saying that there is absolutely the contrary to antagonism between palliative care and euthanasia. In fact, if anything, palliative care practices more euthanasia than general care. Also, the spiritual and existential care for the dying person is much more intense when there is euthanasia than when not. In fact, 16 times more intensive spiritual and existential care. That includes, of course, religious ministrations. Usually that is by ministers of the faith when there is euthanasia. So again, this suggests that there is no antagonism between religious faith and requesting and receiving euthanasia in Belgium. And interestingly, this is the graph with the participation of scientists from all these different countries in the European Association for Palliative Care conferences. And what you see is that Southern Europe, very little participation, and Belgium has the highest participation per capita, meaning in relation to its size in these conferences, and very close to the Netherlands and your country, Sweden. So these are the three countries with the highest participation in palliative care conferences, and if anything, Belgium has the highest. So again, this suggests that there is no antagonism between palliative care and legal euthanasia. On the contrary. Those are a few literature references that you can use. So in conclusion, euthanasia and other life-terminating medical decisions are part and parcel of palliative care in Belgium, although not practiced by some palliativists, who then who refuse to do that. They don't want to touch it with a pole, but they have to tell the patients in advance. There's an interesting comparison between the history of abortion and euthanasia. The International Federation of Gynecologists rejected abortion until 1998, as the European Association of Palliative Care rejected palliative care until 1995. And now the FIGO, International Association, has taken abortion on board for both ethical, ideological reasons, reasons of autonomy of the woman, but also for practical reasons. The FIGO says that abortion is a right, but it also says, besides that, it should be done properly and professionally to avoid, of course, the dramatic abortion situations that existed in the past. So both ideological but also practical reasons. And I suspect, I would predict that in the future the similar attitude will sometime be adopted by palliative care organizations. The take-home messages, just to rub it in very briefly, is that there is no paradox. If Dame Cicely Saunders, who founded palliative care, developed palliative care to prevent euthanasia, then in Belgium we've developed palliative care to enable euthanasia. Let's get this one. Is this experience of interest to other countries? I think it is, and I would add a personal comment that euthanasia, physician-assisted death, is one more manifestation of taking control over our lives. We're taking control over reproduction, over birth, over disease. We're taking control over the end of life now too. This is obviously progress of humanity. And it's also a shift away from interest in survival to quality of life as the principal motive of human behavior. And this is what I do with my other hat. I try to measure quality of life, and this is notoriously difficult, and I would suggest that quality of life is difficult to measure, but when you see it, you know it. Like here, right. This is, it's taken more time than most of us planned, but I did not see you bored, I think, and I thank you for your attention and thank you for having me here.
Well, thank you very much, Jan. Questions?
My name is Anders Nessel. I phoned you from France 3 days ago. I wrote, jag heter Anders Nessel och vi talades vid I telefon för 3 dagar sedan. I wrote an article in the Physiotherapist, the monthly, Swedish monthly, in 1976, and most of us who are here present and active in RTVD have been called fascists, Nazis, sadists, we don't know what we're talking about, etc. But what I would like to ask you about is or comment is the slippery slope. Vad jag skulle vilja kommentera det här, vad säger man nu på svenska? Sluttande planet. In France, where I am active in the sister organization, I Frankrike där jag är verksam inom systerorganisationen, the French Anesthesian Association, den franska Narkosföreningen gives a figure of about between 10 and 15,000 anger denna förening, Narkosläkarföreningen anger, uppskattar till mellan 10 och 15 000 secret under the table euthanasias per year. Alltså uppskattat till mellan 10 och 15 000 hemliga under bordet eutanasier per år. What is that if not a slippery slope?
Yes, absolutely. That's this figure. Interestingly, I don't know exactly how they can estimate it, but this type of investigation, epidemiological investigation, was done with very solid methodology in several countries, including the Netherlands and Belgium. And this is where the figures of 1998 that I showed you come from. In Belgium, 15,000 in France, which has over 50 million. That's about 5 times more than Belgium. That would give for Belgium about 3,000. And that is exactly what we found in Belgium before the law. And that has decreased since the law. So the major impact of the law was to reduce mercy killing by doctors, in clandestine and often not too professionally well done. So France was not among the countries in which this was officially investigated, but I'm not surprised, and this estimate is very reasonable. Yes.
My name is Ellis Wallner. I have several questions. I'll just ask a couple of the more important ones. One thing, I heard a speech here by a Dutch physician, also very prominent in this field, about 4 or 5 years ago in Stockholm. And one thing he mentioned that I really took home with me was that the incidence of suicide among elderly people had reduced in Holland as a result of the legislation. That people felt more confident that they would be taken care of in a proper way at the end of life. I wonder if you have a similar experience with this. A second question is, you didn't mention the family. You talked about the patient having signed something in advance or at the time and so on. Does the family, the immediate relatives, have any important role to either stop euthanasia or to push it forward? And a third thing is, besides religious groups and within the medical profession itself, the opposition to euthanasia, what about the handicap groups? That's one of the major opponents in Sweden, are handicap associations that are worried that what the effects would be.
Yes, the first question related to suicide. I have no figures in mind in Belgium. I can tell you that the rate of suicide is quite high in Belgium too, as in most advanced countries. And there's many ways to look at this, and there's very sad aspects to this, but it is also, in one way, a manifestation of autonomy, isn't it? So, no, I do not know whether the legislation on euthanasia has had an impact on the rate of suicide. Frankly, if it had had a major impact, I would guess I would have heard about it. So I believe it hasn't. I'm not sure. The second question related to the role of the family. It is absolutely clear that the law is absolutely clear that it is the patient, of course, who has the first and the last say in these matters. However, of course, the legislator does mention that it is advisable that this be in harmony with the family. Let me tell you that from experience, from my own, but also from, I hear from many colleagues, oftentimes the patient asks for euthanasia and the family is reluctant. And the defenses of the family must be sort of overcome before euthanasia can be carried out. This is important because one legitimate concern of the public and also of ethicists could be that there would be something like a subtle coercion, pressure exerted on people, nudging them, not forcing them, but nudging them to ask for euthanasia. And I can't deny this is a concern. And then the specter, for instance, of healthcare costs comes into that picture. And the notion that a number of people would feel a burden on their family or a burden even on society if they continue to live. This is a legitimate concern, but let me tell you that the experience, certainly so far, is that there is more resistance to be overcome to carry out euthanasia than there is coercion or nudging towards euthanasia. So the concerns are rather the opposite of the reality is rather more the opposite than the concern. But it remains a concern, I agree. And the third point about the handicap is very important, yes. For instance, you may know the philosopher Peter Singer was booed and picketed in Germany when he gave lectures there because he had come out in favor of animal rights, but also patient rights and euthanasia. Yes, the handicapped. I did not witness anything very important like this in Belgium, but it is a concern, and it might be of interest to you. Those of you who, a couple of you here were in Linköping yesterday and showed other data there. We have studied the quality of life and end of life attitudes towards the end of life among patients with a young colleague of mine who used my methods to measure the quality of life of locked-in syndrome patients. Locked-in syndrome, you are maybe aware of, are people, unfortunate people who already at a young age often have a brain hemorrhage, brain stem hemorrhage, which cuts off all motoric neurological pathways. So they are locked in, they are trapped in a dead body, but their mind is intact. So they hear, they understand, they feel, they have pain, they have an intact head but a dead body. So they communicate only with eyes, blinking, or eye movements. So this is arguably the most devastating condition in that one can imagine among the most severe handicap that exists, probably. And so we investigated their quality of life and their attitudes towards the end of life. And interestingly, the majority of them said they had adapted, and they had a reasonably happy life, the majority. But a very sizable minority were extremely unhappy. And this study was in France, where euthanasia is not legal. But we have had cases like that in Belgium, and they have asked for and received euthanasia. One of them was a lady who had been handicapped for 3 years like this, in locked-in syndrome, and she requested and got euthanasia, and she insisted to donate her organs for organ transplantation, making something good out of her own death. So the handicapped have no case. They have no case because no one, there's never been any pressure on handicapped to ask for euthanasia, but if the minority of them who do wish to die can be allowed to die when there is a law. And they might have a point in that they might say, well, you see, if there is euthanasia and that becomes popular among the handicapped, then there will be less investment of the healthcare system in good care for the handicapped. But we've seen that certainly with euthanasia, the opposite is true. Because there is a legal euthanasia, that is a very strong incentive to keep and to develop palliative care services.
Ja, jag heter Berit Hasselmark, jag är med i föreningen. I wanted to ask one question. In our association here in Sweden, we are often asked if there is a place abroad where we could go to have our lives ended. And of course there is Switzerland and so on. But now I wonder, have you heard foreigners, non-Belgian citizens, who have been able to go to your country and have euthanasia help or not?
Frankly, I have not heard of it. It must occur, but you must remember there's one of the provisions of the law is that there be a good, solid, lasting relationship between the doctor and the patient, right? So the patient must be known well to the doctor, and the patient must repeatedly and consistently express his or her requests with euthanasia. Now that could be achieved by a tourist, right? A euthanasia tourist. But I haven't heard of this happening. Although I suppose there must be a trickle of that. It's not prominent. It hasn't been picked up by the press, for instance.
Well, within the European Union, for instance, nowadays you can go to another country and have an operation done on the hip or something like that, and have it done more quickly. Yeah. So I thought perhaps you could go there and and stay for 3 months and have a good relation with one doctor.
Yes, yes.
Would that be possible, you think? I mean,
oh, yes, yes.
According to law?
Yes, yes.
Well, there you are.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. I've never heard this before. What? That's fantastic. New development. We must talk about that in our association. This is really true.
If there's time for one more question, since I've worked all my life in the insurance industry, I'm just curious, in Belgium or in your neighboring countries, do you know of any concerns or how they've been dealt with from the insurance industry about this moving up of the time of death?
Yeah, very legitimate question. Yes, the industry has adapted to the law. Of course, life insurance was invalidated when one took one's own life, but not in the case of euthanasia. That's an exception. It's not considered as suicide. it's a natural death also, interestingly. There's not a category, it's natural death on the death certificates.
Do we have any more questions? No. I think we have to go on and have some coffee and a bun. There was one question. What were your last words? She wanted to know what you said last there. Försäkring. Naturlig död påverkar inte försäkringen.
Han sa att ibland i försäkringsvillkoren, om det är självmord, så blir det ingen utbetalning. Men han säger att euthanasia, läkare assisterar död, det betraktas som naturlig död, så att det påverkar inte försäkringsutbetalningen.
Samt from Amsterdam.
Yes.